This is part 2 of the secondary transition module. The following graphic displays the components within the secondary transition planning process. These components include future planning, age-appropriate transition assessments, AATA, appropriate measurable post-secondary goals, transition services and activities, course of study, annual IEP goals, and summary of performance. The transition planning components build on each other and will be included each time transition considerations are addressed during each of the student's IEP annual reviews. Transition planning does not start from scratch each year. Rather, transition planning information continues to build and refine as the student moves through school. Transition planning starts with future planning. The student and the student's parents or legal guardian share what the student's plans are upon graduation. The teacher and other involved team members collect and assemble data through age-appropriate transition assessments, AATA. AATA data may be collected formally and/or informally. AATAs must be used to document the student's preferences, interests, needs, and strengths, which are often referred to as PINs. These PINs must be considered when developing the post-secondary goals and the transition services needed to move the student towards attainment of these goals. If the AATA identifies multiple areas of need, it is important for the IEP team to prioritize the needs. The current IEP must then address the highest priority needs and contain documentation that the remaining needs will be addressed in the future IEPs. Remember, the process starts with the student's needs first. A number of free and downloadable AATA resources are provided through the Ohio State Support Team at www.ohioaatalibrary.org. There must be evidence that the measurable post-secondary goals are based on AATA data. Upon the collection of the AATA data, the IEP team develops the student's post-secondary goals. These goals should focus on the areas of education and training, employment, and, if appropriate, independent living. These goals must be based on what the student will do after graduation from high school. Education and training goals address a variety of outcomes, including but not limited to on-the-job training, 2- and 4-year colleges, adult education opportunities, apprenticeships, vocational and technical training with or without certification, military, volunteering, or supported employment. When writing an employment goal, competitive integrated employment must be the first consideration for all individuals with disabilities. Competitive employment is work in the competitive labor market that is performed on a full or part-time basis in an integrated setting. The individual is compensated at or above the minimum wage, but not less than the customary wage and level of benefits paid by the employer for the same or similar work performed by individuals without disabilities. An integrated setting means an employment setting typically found in the community. Here, the individual interacts with people without disabilities to the same extent as individuals without disabilities in comparable positions. These individuals without disabilities do not include supervisory personnel or individuals who are providing services to the employee. Competitive integrated employment includes supported or customized employment. An independent living goal should be considered if there are areas in the AATA data, the IEP profile, the ETR, or elsewhere in the IEP that supports a need. An independent living goal may not be needed if the following two criteria are both met. Database documentation on the IEP demonstrates no need for an independent living goal, and the IEP team agrees there is no need for an independent living goal. Post-secondary goals must be updated at least annually. This review is completed using newly collected AATA data and other relevant data within the IEP. Based on this data, the post-secondary goals might reflect new student interests and/or experiences. The post-secondary goals should show evidence of refinement from generic statements to more specific career, education training, and independent living goals as the student gets older. In most cases, post-secondary goals should be as specific as possible. Vague or generic post-secondary goals at upper ages or grade levels are generally inappropriate. The post-secondary goals should become increasingly detailed and focused over time. If the IEP team determines during the annual review that the data does not support a change, the goal may remain the same. However, the rationale for this decision must be clearly documented within the IEP. Although the school district is not responsible for the student meeting the post-secondary goal after graduating from or exiting high school, the school district is responsible for providing transition services that will reasonably enable the student to move towards attainment of post-secondary goals. Transition services means a coordinated set of activities for a student with a disability that is designed to be within a results-oriented process. Based on the data collected, the team will then determine the student's transition services and activities. Transition services and activities should be individualized to each student's needs and take into account the student's preferences, strengths, and interests. It must be emphasized that the district, not the student or parent, is responsible for providing identified transition services and activities. These services are focused on improving the academic and functional achievement of the student with a disability to facilitate the student's movement from school to post-school activities, including post-secondary education, vocational education, integrated employment, including supported employment, continuing adult education, adult services, independent living, or community participation. At a minimum, the IEP must include at least one transition service addressing each post-secondary goal. Transition services include instruction, related services, community experiences, the development of employment objectives and other post-school adult living objectives. If appropriate, transition services may also include acquisition of daily living skills and functional vocational evaluation. Note that these categories are not meant to stand alone as a service in the IEP. For example, simply writing community experience does not constitute a compliant transition service. A more in-depth description of the community experience is needed. Student names should not be used in the description of transition services, even if the person or agency responsible listed is the intervention specialist or other district staff. For example, Sally Will should be stated as the intervention specialist will. Simply providing an opportunity for a service is not acceptable. School districts must be specific when describing the service they are providing to the student. For example, the statement, "The intervention specialist will provide an opportunity to do X," is too vague, as it may or may not occur. "The intervention specialist will teach X" more clearly describes the service that will take place and may be measured and documented as being completed or not completed. School districts must be prepared to provide evidence that transition services are in progress or have been completed. The type of evidence that will be collected is documented in the Transition Services section of the IEP. Evidence may include, but is not limited to, anecdotal records, checklists, work samples, rubrics. The IEP team will determine the student's appropriate course of study. The student's course of study should align with all the previously identified components of the student's transition planning. The intent of discussing the course of study and including it within the IEP transition plan is to ensure that the student has the academic background and educational experiences to reasonably enable him or her to move towards achieving their post-secondary goals. The graduation requirement for the students in the classes of 2018 and beyond include curriculum and 3 options to show readiness for next steps in college and career. Thus, the course of study must include the curriculum requirements for Ohio high school graduation. Depending on the student's needs, the curriculum may be based upon the Ohio Learning Standards or the Ohio Learning Standards Extended. Additionally, depending on the individual student's preferences, interests, needs, and strengths, the course of study could also include any of the following: career technical education program courses related to post-secondary goals, high school courses for post-secondary credit, curriculum choice provision. This option is currently available only to Ohio graduating classes of 2015 through 2019 and is accompanied by a student success plan that aligns with and does not contradict the IEP, advanced placement courses, and international baccalaureate courses. In addition to writing the course of study, you may choose to delineate the student's specific classes in this section. However, if the student's classes change for any reason, the IEP will need to be amended to reflect the change. The student's future planning, the student's IEP profile, AATA, post-secondary goals, transition services and activities, and the course of study components are to be taken into consideration when developing the annual IEP goals so that they align with the student's post-secondary goals. Needs identified in the most recent ETR must also be considered. The progress towards annual IEP goals impact the student's ability to achieve post-secondary goals after graduation. There must be an annual goal or goals in Part 6 of the IEP that are linked to the transition service needs that have been identified in the areas of education and training, employment, and independent living. This linkage is documented in Part 5 of the IEP. Although the summary of performance is not part of the IEP process, it is a federal requirement and part of the secondary transition planning for students with disabilities who are graduating or who are leaving school because they exceed the age of eligibility for a free appropriate public education, their 22nd birthday, that will assist them in meeting their post-secondary goals. The summary of performance is completed by the IEP team. The summary must be reviewed with the student and parents or guardians as the student prepares to exit high school. IDEA 2004 does not explicitly require a summary of performance for students who are leaving school for other reasons. However, it is the recommendation of the Ohio Department of Education that school districts provide an SOP for these students as well. The SOP provides a summary of the student's academic achievements, a summary of his or her functional performance, and recommendations on how to assist students in meeting his or her post-secondary goals. The purpose of the SOP is to provide guidance so that students know what accommodations and supports might be helpful in post-secondary settings, to assist students in transitioning from high school to post-high school activities, and to provide students with summative documentation that goes with the student when he or she leaves high school. ODE does not require a specific form for the summary of performance. However, it does require that all essential components are included in the SOP. School districts may consider using optional Form 8, OP-8, located on the Ohio Department of Education website. As mentioned previously, secondary transition planning is an ongoing process. There must be evidence from the previous IEP to the current IEP that the IEP team considered any new information or student needs in relation to secondary transition planning. These considerations are evidenced by documentation of progress or completion of specific transition services and activities. The Individual with Disabilities Education Improvement Act of 2004, IDEA, requires each state to evaluate the state's effort to implement the requirements of IDEA. Secondary transition requirements are monitored through Indicator 13, which measures the percentage of students who have an IEP that includes all of the elements of the secondary transition plan. School districts provide this information to ODE through the secondary transition element in the Education Management Information System, EMIS. The National Technical Assistance Center on Transition, NTACT, created a checklist to help school districts ensure that the IEP includes the necessary secondary transition planning components. The Ohio Indicator 13 checklist is adapted from the center's checklist. It reflects the 8 required compliance elements in the secondary transition section of the IEP. Each question on the checklist must be answered either yes or not applicable for compliance purposes. The checklist is available on ODE's website. Note that the checklist is not organized in the order in which transition planning occurs. That is, we do not begin secondary transition planning by generating measurable post-secondary goals, as these goals must be based upon data collected through age-appropriate transition assessments. Educators can use the checklist to review the IEP transition plan. During a monitoring review, every question on the checklist must be answered yes or not applicable by the Ohio Department of Education in order to be found compliant.